Okay, here we are. Another CoVida conversation. I call it CoVida because it's COVID, but it's also life together in this pandemic and maybe post-pandemic world. And I've been interviewing some of my favorite elders in the sustainability, what needs to change in the world. And I'm here with Frances Moore Lappe, or Frankie Lappe, as she is called. So Frankie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, but I'd like to just set this up. What these conversations are about is that with this pandemic, change has started. I mean, things that we thought were brick walls have gone fluid. There's openings, there's cracks. And there's a certain excitement about the realization about how much humans care about each other, that we're all in this skip together. And before this solidifies, and it's even right now, it's starting to get into polarization, all the old stuff. But before it really solidifies, well, things are still really in motion. I'm trying to capture from people who are really the wise elders, perceptions about what's sprouting now that is an idea that we can create, whose time has come. It's like the Milton Friedman quote that says, basically, it's only in times of shock, only times of rapid change, that change happens, and that very often it's guided by the ideas that are hanging around. So we're trying to create some of your perceptions of what's possible as an idea that's hanging around. So with that, that set up, I'd like you to introduce yourself to folks however you'd like to introduce yourself, and then just reflect on the question, and we can make it a conversation eventually, but I'd love to hear just your freewheeling thoughts. Okay.
Well, thank you, Vicki. Thank you so much. I will introduce myself by saying my name again, Frances Moore Lappe, or Frankie. And I am the woman who, at age 26, asked, why is there hunger in the world? Because the experts were telling us that it was all about lack of food. And I went to the UC Berkeley Library and discovered there was more than enough for all of us. And so I wrote Diet for a Small Planet that came out in 1971. And that insight that I had when I was 26 shaped my entire life, because I realized that the experts were wrong because they were looking through a frame that literally, I've come to say, the truth is not seeing is believing, but believing is seeing. And the experts, as we all do, if expert or not, we look through predetermined lenses and we can't see what doesn't fit inside our lens. But because I was a newbie, I was totally untrained in development issues or nutrition. I saw the obvious, that there was plenty for all of us. And the question was, do people have the power to access all this abundance? So it's really not a scarcity of food, but a scarcity of democracy. And so I've gone on to introduce myself. That was one of now 19 books. Not bad for somebody who made a D on her first English paper in college. And my most recent, my most recent book, as several have, it has democracy at center. It's called Daring Democracy. And I wrote it as a cross-generational book with a young man, 49 years my junior, Adam Eichen, who I met at a democracy conference in Mexico City. So I started with this realization of the power of ideas. And that's great if our ideas are aligned with our own nature and the laws of nature, but if they're not, we're in big trouble. So a lot of my work really is so ironic that you start out with Milton Friedman, who made this point that times of crisis are the only time that things can really change, and we pick up the ideas that are lying around, because a lot of my life has been trying to articulate the ideas that his work propagated, his meaning Milton Friedman, and a whole cadre of people that really, I date actually the same year, 1971, when my book came out. There was then awakening of the business class after a very active 1960s social movements creating all sorts of positive change that we experienced, but the business class was very threatened. And so the worldview that they actively put forth was the worldview that government is a threat to our freedom, not a common tool for our citizens to express their freedom, to assure opportunity and security. And so I've been obsessed with this idea for a long time, that we've been trapped in a script that is destined to concentrate power, because it taught that there was such a thing as a free market, which is complete fiction, because every market is driven by rules. And our particular belief is that a market driven by highest return to existing wealth can benefit us all, but obviously if it's returned to the where we end up, and this is quite shocking to many people, but according to World Bank data, we are not only the more extreme in inequality than Western Europe, but more extreme than about 100 countries. So of course, we end up then in this crisis today, not that this crisis invented the coronavirus, but that we end up with a society that is unprepared to deal with a crisis that hits the commons, all of us, as this is. For example, when it first hit, I learned that we ranked 31st in the world in terms of numbers of hospital beds per capita. Here we think of ourselves as so rich and equipped, but we were so unequipped. And so I think that there's such truth in a lot of great seers of our time are saying that we're now facing this double crisis, this immediate crisis of contagion and sickness and death. And we're facing, of course, the existential crisis of climate change that is already estimated to be killing about 150,000 of us annually. So what many are asking, and I am also, is how do we transform this moment that exposes how unprepared we are and how much we depend on each other, and will that then crack this dominant frame that we really don't need a responsible government? It's really just up to us to compete in the marketplace. And so I do think that even if it's not conscious, that the way then we recognize our dependence on one another, our connectedness to one another, just to think that as we walk out of our homes, either we could actually be harming one another or be harmed by someone. I mean, we're that intimate with a connection. And so I think that some of that sense of just we're okay on our own and we'll just struggle on our own, that has to dissolve now. And that, so the theme songs of my life are really pointing to stories, because I believe that the story of separateness and competition was built on a lot of little stories, that just look out for yourself and you'll succeed. And that government is always the enemy and always inefficient, and the real juice is in the private sector and all of that. That what I want to be in my mission right now is to be a storyteller of where all across our country are emerging solutions where actually, especially at the state and local level, government is working with citizens. And there are now, hundreds of cities that have committed to the Paris Agreement. There's a network called We're Still In, where they said that we're still into commitment to the Paris climate goals. And also at state level, positive things are happening. So that's a lot of what my life is about now. You're just really trying to absorb that and then to put it out. I'm writing a little book called It's Not Too Late, Crisis, Opportunity, and the Power of Hope. So another one of my theme songs of my life has been What is Hope? And I've come to see, as I wrote a book called Eco Mind and contrasted the scarcity mind that I identified when I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, that not only is food scarce, but pretty much everything is scarce, including goodness in human beings. And so from that frame, it takes us to a place of fear and of competition and not trusting government, for not even believing in the possibility of a government that could serve the general welfare, which, by the way, is in the preamble to our Constitution, that's what we're about, promoting the general welfare. So I'm really talking more and more about this shift to this view of a world that I call eco-mind, that is characterized by, instead of the S's of scarcity and stasis and separateness, the three C's of, connectedness, continuous change, and therefore we're all co-creators in this worldview that is basically an ecological worldview. And my favorite line there comes from a now deceased, but my dear friend Hans-Peter Dürer, a German physicist, who said to me once, Frankie, in ecological systems, there are no parts, there are only participants. And I love that. So in this ecological worldview, that is where the hope begins, because you realize that hope is redefined, though, because if the nature of life is continuous change and everything is connected, then literally it is impossible to know what's possible because there's just too many things happening. And I find that the most freeing of all, because throughout human history, human beings, we have done what seemed to be impossible, whether you think about, people breaking out of slavery and the civil rights movement. They didn't know, but what they would all be killed. So we only need this sense of possibility that the ecological worldview gives us. Human beings over and over again have shown we don't need certainty of success. We don't need even high probability of success. We just need possibility that maybe my life can make a difference. So I'd love to say that I'm not an optimist. I'm not a pessimist. I am a possibilist, a dynamic possibilist. And that gets me up in the morning, because I think right now, especially in this moment, even though I just got out of the COVID epidemic myself, with new energy and this personal experience of the disease, and feel like that is the place to be, that just in this sense of possibility that, that many people are saying now that can open us to really grappling with the biggest threat, which is the climate threat. And so I could just go on talking about stories.
Yeah, I have some questions. I have several questions, and you can pick what you want to respond to. So one of them is that when you talk about democracy working, you go to the city and then the state. You're not talking about the national government. And so I heard something there about subsidiarity, about that the closer people feel to having some power in the decisions that are made that influence their lives, the more they can be possibility thinkers. And I'm curious your response to this, that, it seems like there are these blocks forming in the United States. There's the West Coast block and the Northeast block and the Midwest block around the response to the virus. It's almost like we're recognizing that we have these subcultures which are very different and very difficult to govern, because our interests as individual human beings, we're good people and we try to do our best, but somehow our lifestyles are so different, like crowded West Coast cities or East Coast, and then this sort of rural, spaced out. Anyway, I'm going on too long with my question. So that question is about, is the United States the best idea in terms of empowered citizens crafting their future in this, with more eco-mind? And yeah, and so that's one question, and you can do that one or not. And then the other one is, in what ways do you think that this pandemic is preparing us to address the climate threat, which to me seems like, we're dealing with a little wave and there's this big wave coming in from the ocean. So whichever one or both you want to address, I'd be super interested.
Well, great questions. And this is my life trying to sort out how to even think and talk about it. But the foundational shift that I see is the idea that a public good has to be represented in a public entity, the government, which has gotten such a bad connotation, that is truly accountable to us, what I call living democracy. And so I think that, if nothing else, and I'm repeating myself, but that we see now how dependent we are on the choices that our governments at every level are making to protect our well-being, but to make these huge decisions about when this quarantining can stop. That's just one example, not to mention preparedness and on testing and hospital beds. So I think this understanding that the public sector is absolutely essential to our well-being. And so that, I think, especially in states where government is just so derided as a problem, not a solution, as Ronald Reagan loved to say, I think that's very deep. And I think that we have to appreciate that a lot of good things are happening in areas that we don't associate with progress, say, on renewable energy, because some of the states that are leading the way, I think of my home state of Texas. Yes, it is still a big oil producer, but if it were a country, Texas would now be the third largest producer of wind energy in the world. And it's such an interesting story how it came to be. In part, it had to do with reframing the language. They didn't use the language of regulation, which I've always hated that term because people think nobody likes to be regulated. So they use the term standard, this renewable energy portfolio standard, and everybody likes standards, right? So in any case, it was a definite role for government in Texas that led to this phenomenal spread of wind energy. And it also included, I think you, Vicki, will really appreciate this if you're not aware, and I haven't been able to dig deep enough to really interview people to understand how this happened, but one of the ways that it happened was that a random selection of citizens were brought together in Texas and offered, the pros and cons of all sorts of energy options. And they expressed at the end a desire for more conservation and renewable energy. And so, having grown up there, it's shocking to me, and I love to tell, just to crack our and Georgia is another example of real progress that we don't think of as a state that would confront climate change, but a state that is able to grapple with what makes common sense, and is moving very strongly as a leader. So I think that's really important to recognize, and also that how the face-to-face, the subsidiarity that you mentioned, that at the city level and the state level where you can make face-to-face connection with people. And so that's why I love this We're Still In coalition. And stories that I tell very much, one I love is the state of Maine, which I don't think of as necessarily a progressive bastion. A young woman there in her 20s beat a Republican businessman in her local district and put forth Green New Deal legislation that was passed, and others passed additional similar kinds of bills that are just exactly what we're hoping for, addressing poverty by offering really good apprenticeship jobs in renewables at the same time, really help address climate change. So it's addressing poverty and climate change at the same time. Mm-hmm. And she talked to me about how, this is Chloe Maxman is her name, and how she realized in the beginning, running for office, that it was all about personal relationships and walking down these little dirt roads in rural Maine, and nobody'd ever had a candidate come to their door before. And so she said people were so disconnected from government and so distrusting, and but making those face-to-face connections, that people voted for her who would never in her Republican district never have if she hadn't done that. So this very real sense of connectedness to place, and loyalty to preserve what you have in a home that you love. I mean, that's was motivating her. So I really was moved by that. And so that is this moment, I think, opens us to see that as a possibility, that we could really go deeper on our rethinking democracy. So one of the passions of my life now, and I'm working very hard on a website, not exactly what I thought I'd be doing, but it's called just democracymovement.us. It will be called democracymovement.us, so that people can just see, oh my gosh, you know, whatever state I'm in, here people are actually changing the rules so that money is sidelined and my voice is heard. And so if viewers haven't seen it, an example of this is a movie that released a couple of weeks ago called Slay the Dragon, Slay the Dragon. And it highlights one of my favorite stories of possibility, which is Katie Fahey in Michigan, where she was just a young woman who got fed up with gerrymandering in Michigan that meant that Democrats could win most of the votes, but in the polling places, but not have the seats in the legislature. And she just got this amazing response on Facebook, and led a statewide movement, going library to library, and she had standing room only discussions with people, all bipartisan, and ended up passing a state constitutional amendment. And so Slay the Dragon, and she's just so disarmingly real. It's not about, oh, I'm a hero at all. It's we are doing this together. And so I highly recommend that. And if we can get more of those kinds of videos out to show what's possible, because that the knowing about a democracy movement that I'm part of absolutely changed my life. 4 years ago, I marched. I didn't think I could walk 10 miles. And I marched over 100 from Philadelphia to Washington for democracy reforms. And that was the basis or the inspiration of our book, Daring Democracy. So part of this shift from scarcity mind to eco mind and to possibility is rethinking democracy, not as a fixed structure that we'd inherited, not the dull, blah, spinach. I love spinach, but anyway, not the dull, blah spinach we have to eat to get our personal, dessert of personal freedom, but democracy as a thrilling way of life that meets our deepest human needs for power, for a voice, right? For meaning, that we're actually laying the foundation for a livable future for our children. And third, real connection, because in that march, Vicki, I met people I would never have met otherwise, an ex-banker, a lawyer from Southern California, and teenagers I never would have met. And when you go into public like that and you meet people that you wouldn't be your best friends, and yet they believe in these same values that you do, democracy, a fair vote for everyone, a fair voice for everyone. It was just so changed my life, and thought, yeah, we can do this. And we had the biggest sit-in on the Capitol steps, I believe, at least in living memory. Of course, none of the corporate media covered it. In fact, one of our chants on the Capitol steps was, where is corporate media? Where is corporate media?
Right.
But it was life-changing. And so one of my missions now, even more so coming with this tragedy that we're all facing of the COVID-19 epidemic, is continuing to work on offering this in this reality that's still invisible, that there is a growing democracy movement that is at city level, at state level, and, excuse me, now we have in Congress, and if we have a new Senate, we could pass, which is like the dream wish of all the people who I was marching with. It's H.R. 1, introduced by John Sarbanes from Maryland, who was actually our speaker at the end of our march, and now through the House has passed his For the People Act. And so, you know, that's out there now and has many co-sponsors. So if we can change the Senate, then perhaps we can even move at the national level, because it has many, many good provisions that will diminish the power of money in our system.
Wow. So I'd like to talk to you forever, and I'd like to wrap this up. So I want to,
Okay.
yeah, I want to feed back on a couple of things, and then maybe you can make a last comment. One is your enthusiasm is so infectious. You are the drug we need at the moment.
Well, back at you, Vicki.
Yeah, well,
that's how you affect me.
Okay. So two things I heard from you that are really, I think, key is my little motto, if I have a motto, is it's a relational world. It's not a world of things, it's a world of relationships.
Right.
That it actually is. I mean, I would assert that that's the truth. It's, yeah, and it's sort of very aligned with what you're saying. And that politics is relational, family is relational, school is, everything's relational. When you go to school, it's your best teachers who get through to you. And in politics, it's all about relations, moving energy in a community. And our arguments in this democracy are all about things. They're not relational. And the other thing I wanted to pull out, so it just is encouraging that it's not an ipso facto. It's not like, well, if I have like 6 better relationships, then somehow or another, but it actually is true. I mean, in my community, people will turn to me for things, and it's simply because I'm so relational that I always know who they can talk to. Because I'm webbed out everywhere, and I'm not political. I feel like I'm just a lover that wants everybody to be, everything to be working. The other thing is that you pointed to, and I think it's an innovation whose time may have come, is these citizen juries or the wisdom councils, or, you know, this idea that you could get a group of citizens together, a randomly chosen group of citizens, and they could make a better decision than politicians who have they owe a lot to a lot of different people, and they're sort of hogtied. And it's one of those ideas like the Green New Deal, not the Green New Deal, but like universal basic income, you know, free college education. There's ideas that are out there that are now actually center stage, or universal health care, however you have access to it.
Yeah.
There are ideas that are possible now that were not possible before, because we see that we need them. They are the obvious thing. And so I'm just enthused by your enthusiasm for this thing called democracy, which is really relationships between people talking about what matters most and seeing how together we can make something happen that's better for everybody. And when you're in that flow, that flow of democracy or empowerment or love or whatever you call it, when you're in the flow of democracy, your life is exciting, and then you hit walls. Yeah. Of course you hit walls, but then you
hit walls when you have buddies. When you hit them, you're not alone.
Exactly. And you have, I think the other thing that you see is that maybe you hit a wall, but 10 years later, there's a politician who comes along who takes credit for your idea and makes it happen. That there's a time lag between effort and effect in this. And so your spirit of good cheer and enjoying the game and not the goal You know, the goal is that it's a good game. Democracy is
Yeah.
a good game to play. The goal is not this policy or that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've caught from the conversation. So if you want to say anything in your summary.
Well, your thoughts remind me of an earlier thought I had during the Obama administration before Obamacare became Obamacare, because I thought, oh, if I could only get his ear, and maybe we could get, if Joe Biden wins, we could get his ear, that instead of just passing Obamacare, what if prior to that he'd invited people to libraries and other public places and who had put together, like they did in Texas with the renewable energy, materials that both sides, you know, different points of view agree with, and people get to hear a number of points of view, and then together, all over the country, we're debating what would, you know, what would a better healthcare system look like. And it just was such a moment that I think he could have pulled that off, and and then digested it. You know, there could be a website, easily government-sponsored website, where we see all the results of all these library discussions. And I could imagine that now going forward, because we know that Obamacare is not sufficient, and we see it now with COVID. You know, so yes, I love this idea of and that example. If anybody wanted to go to the website of James Fishkin, it's called. I'm blanking on his particular approach is called citizen, not citizen jury, but
No,
anyway,
we'll put it in the we'll put it.
anyway,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
deliberative polls. It
Yeah.
doesn't quite capture it for me, because poll kind of, but that's what they call it, and you can read about what they've done. There's a beautiful website. He's at Stanford, but I love your bringing up that, because that is so aligned with my understanding of democracy, and so yeah, I really love that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm like I'm raring to go.
Okay. Yeah, well,
You got
remember,
me.
I declare myself a dyed-in-the-wool possibilist, and
Yeah.
I think this world of relationships says that's where we are, that it's not possible to know what's possible, so therefore, let's just go for it. You know,
Exactly.
that's
Thank you
all we
so
need.
much. Yeah,
You're
thank you
so
so,
welcome.
so much, Frankie.
My
This
great
has
pleasure.
been wonderful. I am inspired.